how to run better performance review meetings. I help companies improve their performance management processes, the processes they use to actually implement their strategy and review their strategy. And one of the biggest problems is how they're actually reviewing performance on a regular basis. What I find is that lots of those performance review meetings are completely backwards looking, where you simply look at performance against targets in the last quarter. So there are lots of snapshots of performance saying this is where we are today against the target we set for today, rather than a discussion about what needs to happen in the future. I remember working with one of the oil majors, and one of the senior vice presidents came to me and said, can you review my performance pack and my presentation? I'm presenting this to the board. So I looked through his pack and his slides, and he basically had something like 48 slides for a 45-minute board slot, and every slide was more or less the same, saying this was the target and this is what we delivered. And then if they delivered it, his message was, and this is why we are fantastic, and when they didn't deliver some of their targets, he was saying, and okay, this is why, and this is the department who's to blame for this. So I said, this is all interesting stuff, but how much time do you intend to talk about the next quarter? Because everything in here is now talking about the last quarter. And then he came back at me and said, actually, this is a performance review meeting, so we're reviewing the last quarter. So what we then did in this oil company is we then changed the processes. We put a rule in place where you are only allowed to spend 20% of the time in those meetings talking about the past, and the vast majority, 80%, about the future, about the next quarter. So this has completely changed the nature of those meetings, and we changed the name of them too. So people don't come back and say, like, this is a performance review meeting. So we changed the name to a performance improvement meeting. So the emphasis is shifted from the past to the future. Google does something very similar. They now talk about performance preview meetings rather than performance review meetings. And the other thing that happens is that very often boards or senior decision-making groups are given performance reports, and then they sit in those performance review meetings or those performance discussions, and this is quite often the first time they look at the data. And even if they've seen that before, quite often the data is not very easily accessible, so they get pages and pages of data. I was working with an internet company recently, and their quarterly management information pack was over 500 pages. So you can imagine that none of the directors will have looked at every single page before they come into the meeting. So you have to question then, why do you give it to them? So what happened in the RAF, for example, the Royal Air Force, is that we also changed those meetings. And what we now do is what they're now doing is they're bringing the business analysts into the meeting. So they have improved the way performance is reported, and I've recently done a few videos on this, or if you go to my website, I've got lots of articles on how to improve performance reporting too. But what they did is the commanders now get a pre-briefing with an analyst. They then come into the meeting, but then the analyst turns up, and this is almost like the executive team now acts like a jury in a court trial, where they know exactly what question they want to have an answer to. They have some idea about the evidence and the data, but then the analyst comes in almost like an expert witness in a court trial, and they can then ask them questions about some of the things that were not so clear in the data and the performance report. They can ask, how do we analyze the data? How many customers did we actually interview for our customer data, and so on. And then you have this forwards and backwards, almost like a cross-examination in a courtroom. Then they get all the answers, and then they can make a decision. And now they're making one decision after the other about the future of the business. So this is how you run better performance review meetings. Change the name from a performance review to a performance improvement and performance preview meeting. Change the focus from the past to the future. maybe even put rules in place of how much time you're allowed to spend in the past and how much in the future, and then bring the analyst into the meeting so they can act as expert witnesses. And this is how decisions will be made about the future of the business, rather than simply looking into the past and simply reviewing what was good and bad in the last quarter, because this is a little bit like driving a car and only looking into the rear view mirror. If you would like to learn more, head to my website at bernardmar.com, where you can find tons of articles, white papers and videos that will give you a lot more insights into real-world case studies and examples.